Let's take a look this time and look on the technicality parts of the supply chain flexibility. We'll do an actual experiment to see if we can reduce the overall cost by looking at a food and beverage manufacturer. We're going to take five product families, like we mentioned previously, with five different plants, and our target is to be about 90% efficient in comparison to our forecast. But you already know the very first rule that we learned is that the forecast is always wrong. So, with that being said, the chance of being 90% efficient, man, you can probably pull that off. So, the objective is threefold. Number one, determine the cost benefits of flexibility of supply chain. We already talked about the fact that the more flexibility you're going to have, you have a couple things. Number one, your transportation costs, especially with multiple plants, will be much lower. And then what you have that, but your manufacturing costs will be higher because you have to have multiple different setups readily available to ship in a rapid motion. So with that being said, the approximate level of flexibility that you're going to have, and then does it provide the demand if the demand differs from the forecast? You want to pay attention to those aspects. Let's look at one of the most basic things you can look at is the labor cost. Here you have a typical American spreadsheet, and you'll have massive different numbers depending upon where you're at, and also as to what the inflation currently is that we have in the United States. Pennsylvania, for example, 12.33 an hour. Ohio, 10.64. Amarillo, Texas, 10.80. Nebraska, 12.41. Modesto, California, 16.27. Those are huge ranges, and you're going to have to pay attention to tweaking them. You got to think maybe, but gee, maybe that plant over in Modesto, it's really expensive to run that, but I have some super high talented workers there. And if I do that, I'm going to lose access to that specific labor pool, which will really help us an awful lot. So look as to the firm that produces stock and look at the aspect of the five plants with eight different distribution centers, and you'll see all those out there. And then is the demand proportional to the population density? But is highly uncertain because of variability in your supply chain. So pay attention to all the different things. Inbound transportation carried mostly through full truckload carriers. Now, I got to tell you, that's a huge, huge factor. One driver pulls in, hey, I got this whole truck full of stuff, unload it. So you pull out 28,000 pounds of goods and boom, and the trucker takes off. And life is simple. If you have a less than truckload carriers, one of the biggest less than truckload carriers used to be called Yellow. And after almost 100 years of an operation, they finally couldn't handle it and they actually folded up. And everybody's now jockeying to pick up pieces of the giant different aspects of the Yellow freight line. Less than truckload costs a lot of money. That means one trucker pulls in, you're paying the trucker wages to haul things around the country for you. And so then he has to make multiple different stops, seven, eight different stops to unload his 28,000 pounds that he has in the back of his truck. All of a sudden now, that trucker, you're paying a much larger amount of money because of the multiple stocks, and you have a different frustration level of everybody involved in the process. So full truckload is fabulous. Less than truckload, not so much. Okay, especially if you have a private fleet because you have dedicated drivers, dedicated trucks, dedicated trailers, and you're moving things all over the place. Current strategy focused on reducing manufacturing costs, and in the process, you might have to deal with less than truckload carriers or maybe even smaller trucks because maybe things are more regional, depends upon your circumstances. But the whole thing is to squeeze down the overall cost. Then so you have a higher volume product is produced at the low cost plant in Dayton. That's a really sharp idea because you have volume, whereas you have a low volume product produced in Modesto because you have a higher cost manufacturing facility. So between the two, you already have some intelligence happening in the process. The more expensive labor costs will put your low volume products out there because no matter how much you produce, you're going to still have low volume. The high volume take advantage of the cheap labor in Ohio, so you have a different dispersion of your overall cost. A lot of times you look at dedicated manufacturing, sometimes it might be good. Maybe that Modesto plant, you just create one product only, and that's it. Because of the high labor cost, you take your one product, ship everything there, and you have to then balance out the aspect of your transportation costs, your manufacturing costs, but maybe it's worth it if you run the numbers. And then look on flexibility, maybe the other plants you have too. maybe in each plant you have a different type of formula that has the how they operate. Now you're starting to deal with a huge analysis of 5 plants, 8 distribution centers with 5 products. All of a sudden now you got to start thinking about transportation costs and different numbers involved. And even though it sounds complex, this is not rocket science. It's just common basic math when you look at it. Full flexibility, can you match with 3 product families? Maybe down in Texas, they can do 3. Maybe Texas is really versatile and you got a much more inexpensive manufacturing facility and you have a relatively low cost of labor. Maybe you can sit down and have a massive distribution center, including with your manufacturing plant as well. That could be a fabulous place to have all 5 going on full flexibility. Maybe Modesto is only 1 product. Maybe in Ohio, you got 3 going because the labor is still the cheapest one of your 5 different areas. And maybe Nebraska, since it's the middle of the country, maybe that one can all, you got to think about the aspect of 4, 5, full flexibility. It depends what you have and what you can do, depending upon the facilities, the labor pools, and all the different costs associated with it. Let's look at this over here. Let's look at the production cost, the plant to warehouse shipping costs, warehouse to customer shipping costs, and also warehouse fixed costs. All those are variables for you to consider on each and every individual plant. Frankly, it would be kind of a fun calculation. It depends. Keep in mind, I'm a college professor. Our version of fun might be a little bit different from your version of fun, but overall, trying to figure out all the different algebraic things to sit down and include all those costs, the cost accounting part is actually very interesting to a lot of us. So look on the baseline, look on, can you do 2? Can you do 3? Can you sit down and do 4? Can you do 5 products in each plant? Your production cost is certainly going to be higher because no matter what happens, you have to have that flexibility. You have to be able to stop and do a setup change. Sometimes you don't even have to stop. Sometimes you can push a button and boom, the tooling changes just like that because of the new technology we have. So you have that. We also have some of the new things. Sometimes in the manufacturing process, the old way always works. If you're doing something like the disappearing wax aspect for molding, that aspect of it, that's been around 1,000 years. But sometimes of the new technology, sometimes your different types of machines, your different lathes can actually do almost a quick instant pivot on the setup. It depends how much money you've invested overall. Look at the plant to warehouse shipping costs. There's a difference there. If you look on the baseline, it's $20 million. But if you do 5, okay, each plant does 5, all of a sudden it drops dramatically to something much lower. So here's a good image of where the cost can be. You can plant to warehouse shipping costs can drop dramatically if you do all 5. Is it worth the money to make that change? So the maximum savings on the variable is a full flexibility is 13%. That's a lot of money. So 80% of the benefits of full flexibility is captured by adding a minimum of 2 flexibility. You start looking at balancing the different numbers, pay attention to what you have. Your total supply chain cost as a function of the degree, the flexibility, you really have decreasing marginal returns. Sometimes it isn't worth it going full flexibility, but it might be worth it to do full flexibility on your 2 lowest cost labor plants that have that hyper flexibility, and then focus in maybe in the Modesto, California, with your highest labor costs, maybe they only produce 1 product. It's going to take a little bit aspects of it but really, if you tweak that forecast accuracy, and by the way, sometimes no matter how good that forecast is, you know it's going to be wrong. As long as you're in the ballpark of that 90% plus aspect of it, life can be good. It just depends how you're having. But overall, look at the different scenarios. Growth for 2 leading products by 25%, 5% decrease in demand. So that's why you have different scenarios. I always prefer to use a 3 scenario forecast. I normally forecast a middle scenario where I think it's going to really be, and then I have, man, life is really good forecast, and then life is really bad forecast. I always tend to do 3 of them, and you always want to sit down there and figure out what it's going to be. What happens though, the reality is you have to use a baseline. I normally use a 3-year baseline to make my predictions for budgeting. The same thing applies in supply chain. Use a baseline as to what you're going. See, do you have 5% growth each year? Did you have a peak last year at 12% growth in 1 product and a decline of 2% in 1? Start figuring out what your overall baseline for your products is, your production, your labor costs, and then do your projections from there. Flexibility creates new paradigms for the supply chain. Research the cost before you step forward. And there's a lot of costs, a lot of variability, and geographic costs really are a major component because geographic is about distribution, it's about product, it's about labor. So pay attention to that, especially that could be the most expensive part of your entire flexibility applications. Take care.